Why don't you sit up there? No? Okay. Welcome. I'm Dr. Ray A. Beer, the Executive Director of the IRL, the William T. Robinson III Institute for Religious Liberty. And we're thrilled that you're here with us tonight and know that you will enjoy the profound words from George Weigel, one of the great Catholic intellectuals of this century, I believe. Now, I'd like to invite to the podium Monsignor Gerald Twiddell, who will do the invocation.
Let us pray. O God, creator of all, you give us life and plant within us a longing to know you. You reveal your truth in the beauty of the universe. You draw us toward your goodness, and you arouse a hunger within us to give fitting expression to the wonder in our hearts, a yearning to deepen our knowledge of you, our source and origin, to discover words to express our gratitude for all your gifts. As we strive to discover how best we might show our reverence for you, we confess our failures to respect one another's efforts as we ought. Give us your wisdom to build a world where all are valued and their religious convictions are honored. Give us hearts to welcome those who find themselves compelled to flee their homes to find a place where they can, in safety, live out their lives in freedom of conscience. Grant that we may learn from this evening's presentation ever more fully to respect one another's right to live out our faith in freedom, peace, and tranquility, so that our voices may join together in one great symphony of praise as we proclaim, to you be all honor and glory forever. Amen.
Thank you, Monsignor. And providing an official welcome tonight is our president of Thomas More University, Dr. Joseph Chillo.
Thank you, Ray, and certainly a warm welcome to all for adventuring out on this wintry evening. It's going to be promising to be a great evening tonight here at Thomas More, and I certainly want to extend a warm welcome to all of you who are joining us for the William T. Robinson III Institute for Religious Liberty. Last evening, I had a wonderful opportunity to have dinner with Professor George Weigel and enjoyed our conversation immensely. I can promise you tonight that you're going to enjoy the same evening as we had this journey with him as one of the leaders of Catholic theology and certainly scholarship in our country. But one of the fascinating things, and I'm going to embarrass George for a second, that I'm going to share with you is anybody who can connect the stories of Pope John Paul II with Brooks Robinson, you can tell he's unique. And certainly the depth and the scope of his work is certainly astonishing, and I'm certainly in awe of the work that he has done over his lifetime, and certainly the work that he continues to do. For our students, this is a great opportunity to see how a Catholic liberal arts education comes about. You know, we talk a lot about that here at Thomas More in terms of making that connection, not just in terms of the mission and the work that our faculty do every single day, but certainly the values of a Catholic education and certainly the benefits of a Catholic education that our students experience here firsthand. So I want to extend a warm welcome to all of you here to this evening and certainly engage in this great conversation and turn it over to our director for the Center for Faith, Mission, and Catholic Education, Hannah Keegan.
Thanks, Joe. Thank you. So, good evening. Welcome to Thomas More University. I have the privilege of introducing Professor George Weigel tonight. His CV is very long, and I am giving you the Sparks Notes version so we can get into the meat of the presentation. It's very fitting that at the beginning of this series of celebratory events in honor of the 20th anniversary of the passing of St. John Paul II, we have Professor Weigel here as the biographer of St. John Paul II. So we're asking him to give a presentation on John Paul II and religious liberty, and that will be followed by a Q&A. So I invite you to take your questions seriously as he's talking and keep track of them so we can interrogate him after his presentation. Professor Weigel is a Catholic theologian and one of America's leading public intellectuals. He is a distinguished senior fellow of the Ethics and PublicPolicy Center in Washington and holds their William E. Simon Chair in Catholic Studies. He has been a senior Vatican analyst for NBC News since 1999. He is one of the world's premier authorities on the Catholic Church and a New York Times best-selling author. His books have been translated into 16 languages. He is perhaps best known for his widely translated and internationally acclaimed 2-volume biography of St. John Paul II, this very large, beautiful book sitting on the desk right there. It's titled Witness to Hope, which the Boston Globe accurately calls one of the most interesting histories of our time, this interesting history of this saint, and its sequel, The End in the Beginning. His bio is much longer, but suffice it to say, it is an honor to have you speaking here with us, and we are eager to learn more from your experience. Let's welcome Professor Weigel and enjoy learning more about this saint.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. I noticed a certain lack of immediate recognition when the name Brooks Robinson was mentioned. For those of you who are not serious baseball fans, I will explain that Brooks Robinson is a Hall of Fame third baseman, was one of the heroes of my boyhood, and was a man of such character that he was once compared to Reggie Jackson in these terms. In New York, they named a candy bar after Reggie. In Baltimore, they named their children after Brooks. It's very nice to be here. I want to thank Dr. Ray Hebert for organizing all this very, very assiduously over the last year or so. Dr. Chillo, I certainly enjoyed our evening together last night. The faculty and students I met today, everyone has been wonderfully hospitable. And it's for us who consider bourbon one of God's greatest gifts to humanity. It's always great to be here at the Fons et Origo of the holy juice here. It's also appropriate to talk about John Paul II and religious freedom in a university named for Thomas More. We're all familiar, I'm sure, with the movie A Man for All Seasons. Some of you may have read the play A Man for All Seasons, which was written by Robert Bolt, who was in fact an atheist. And while Bolt's script, both in the play and the movie, is quite striking, he actually gets more wrong. Because if you read the introduction to the play, A Man for All Seasons, he presents Thomas More as a kind of existential hero. Remember, this is a play written in the early 1960s, who dies in defense of his sense of self. You know, his own sense of who he is. And that, of course, is not exactly right, because Thomas More was, in fact, a martyr for Catholic truth, including the truth that the Church cannot subordinate the truths it knows from both revelation and reason to the demands of state power. That's what Thomas More died for. He died for that great truth. I actually had once the opportunity to take a behind-the-scenes look into the Tower of London, where, of course, More was imprisoned for
considerable period of time before his death. And I was spent about a half an hour in his cell. And it's exactly what you might imagine from the movie. If you remember the scene in the movie when the seasons are changing and you look out this little narrow window and you see snow, and then you see the kids playing in the spring, and you see the swans on the Thames. I was looking out that window. And I will now make a public confession that the masonry in that cell had crumbled rather badly. And there was a little pile of masonry, of which I took 3 pieces and surreptitiously stuck them in my pocket. One of which I gave to Congressman Henry Hyde, one of the great pro-life leaders of America, for whom I did major speech writing for 20 years. Henry had a great devotion to Thomas More. I still have one of those pieces, and I cannot remember who I gave the third to. But in any event, when I am at a Thomas More named place, I feel at home. But I do want to clarify that point right at the beginning, that while in Robert Bolt's view, he may have been an existential hero, and there's some element of truth in that, More was in fact a Catholic martyr. Now, we're thinking about religious freedom, religious liberty, in a Catholic key. We have to understand that we're thinking within a broader Catholic reflection on the relationship between religious authority and political authority, or between church and state. And the roots of a Catholic theory of church and state, what we would call it today, or more generically religious authority and political authority, run very, very deeply indeed. They run all the way back to the 22nd chapter of St. Matthew's Gospel in the 21st verse. When the Lord says, "Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's," that statement, as it worked its way through the history of Western civilization, was fundamental to what we know now as the right of religious freedom. Why? Think about what that means. Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and unto God what is God's. The first thing it means is if there are things of God that are not things of Caesar, then Caesar is not omnipotent. Caesar's power is a limited power. That's a very important thing in a world in which political power tends to aggrandize more and more to itself. So the very statement that there are things of God's that are not things of Caesar's means that Caesar is not omnipotent, which means that Caesar's power is limited, which means if that state power or political authority is limited, then there is space. There's room in society where the writ of Caesar does not run, especially the realm of conscience, which, as Vatican II taught us, is the human person's most secret core and sanctuary where the human dialogue with God takes place. The writ of Caesar does not run there. So the earliest step in a Catholic theory of religious freedom, a contemporary Catholic Church state theory, goes all the way back to the New Testament. So the notion that this is simply a contemporary development under certain historical pressures is just not the case. A couple of other key moments are worth mentioning. There was a pope in the late 5th century named Gelasius, Pope Gelasius I. And he wrote an important letter to the Byzantine emperor of the day, whose name was Anastasius, in the year 494, at the very end of the 5th century. And in that letter, he distinguished between what he called in Latin the auctoritas sacrata and the regalis potestas, the priestly authority and regal or kingly power. Those were the two authorities that were always at work in the world. They were going to be in some sort of relationship and some sort of tension, but they were distinct. They were distinct. That Gelasian dyad, priestly authority, or more broadly, religious authority, and potestas regalis, kingly authority, that dyad would become very important in the late 20th century as the Catholic Church, on the edge of the Second Vatican Council, was trying to formulate a theory of religious freedom. But that's to get ahead of the story a little bit. Another critical moment in this journey comes in the High Middle Ages, when there was a great ongoing, for decades, even a century, contest over who had the authority, who had the right to invest a bishop. There was not really an argument over who could ordain a bishop, but being ordained and then being put in the job and given the symbols of authority and authorized to exercise episcopal authority, that was a separate thing. And there was a great fight called the investiture controversy, which went on for decades, the high point of which was the Holy Roman Emperor, then a German king, Henry IV, kneeling in the snow in Canossa, Italy, begging the forgiveness of Pope Gregory VII, who was insisting on the right of the church to both ordain and invest bishops. And Henry IV finally concedes this. Why was that important? It was important as a warning, because Henry broke the deal a few years later, maybe when the weather improved and he didn't have to stand out in the snow in penance. It was important because it was an assertion of the right by Pope Gregory VII, who is now a canonized saint, the right of the church to order its own life by its own standards, not by somebody else's standards, not by the state standards. The defense of what was called in Latin the libertas ecclesiae was a defense of the church's authority and right to order its own internal life according to its self-understanding. Political modernity, which begins in the late 18th century, sharpened the question of the relationship of church and state in the Western world in several ways. One was attack, and the other was a new situation. As for the attack, I think we all know that the French Revolution made a concerted effort, leading to an enormous amount of bloodshed, to destroy the Catholic Church. Not simply as an institution in its own right, but to uproot all of Christian civilization and, in effect, begin all over again. So you get, a new calendar. You get the goddess of reason set up in Notre Dame. You have the great martyrdoms of the French Revolution, the civil constitution of the clergy, in which the French clergy were turned into, or attempted to be turned into, basically state employees. Then later in the 19th century, there was the German Kulturkampf, Bismarck's attempt to bend the Catholic Church to the will of the new German Reich, the Second Reich, which had been formed in the wake of the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. And that Kulturkampf, that culture war against the Catholic Church, saw Catholic properties seized all over Germany, the new German Empire, saw any number of bishops jailed for many years, an assault by political modernity on the church in the name of subordinating the church to state power. The Italian Risorgimento, the attempt to bind together the various regions of Italy into a single state, was a deeply secular and anti-clerical affair. Organized in many respects against the Catholic Church. There's in fact an entire neighborhood in Rome today, the Prado, near the Vatican, that was built in post-Italian unification Italy to block the view of St. Peter's. Okay, so if you're walking through the Prado, which is a nice neighborhood with some high-end shops and apartment buildings and whatnot, you cannot see St. Peter's. That's all. They weren't dumb enough to tear it down, but they wanted to assert the fact that this was not the center of Italian life anymore. So-called enlightened monarchs, like the Emperor Joseph II of Austria, the son of Maria Theresa of Austria, said that he wanted the church to be a department of the police. The church is a department of the police. What's the church good for? It's only good for keeping people under control. So the attempt by a so-called enlightened monarch to turn the church into a kind of clerical gendarmerie. So throughout the 19th century, there is this concerted attack of political modernity on the church, further examples of which we could get into. But there was also a new situation. And that was the situation here in the United States, where there was no state church, the typical European model, altar and throne united. But Catholicism was flourishing. There was no state church, but there was a flourishing Catholic church, even if that church was often under certain forms of cultural persecution by Protestants. This raised a very important question. Could the institutional separation of church and state, constitutionally embodied and mandated, be good for the church? The church has spent hundreds of years thinking that in one way or another it needed the help of the state in order to do what it alone could do. The American experience suggested that there might be another way of looking at this. It took the authorities of the church in Rome a while to wrap their heads around this issue, around this question. Such that, for example, shortly after the Treaty of Paris formed the new United States out of the 13 original colonies, and Benjamin Franklin was representing the United States in France, which had been a great ally of the United States during the American Revolution. The Pope at the time, Pope Pius VI, decided they might need to get a bishop in the United States. There were no bishops here at the time of the American Revolution. There were maybe 24 priests, 35,000 Catholics, primarily in Maryland and the lower counties of Pennsylvania. So the Pope sent a messenger to Benjamin Franklin, the representative of this new American Republic in France, and said, who do you think should be your Catholic bishop? And to the utter astonishment of Pius VI, Benjamin Franklin said, that's none of our business. That's your call. That hadn't happened to a pope in hundreds of years. I mean, the Pope had various degrees of freedom in appointing bishops throughout the European world, but it was always at least with the tacit consent of the public authorities. And here's a country that says, not our business. That's up to you. And of course, that became the case. The priests of the United States recommended the appointment of John Carroll as the first bishop of the United States, and the story goes on from there. However, the attack of political modernity did not end with the 19th century. In fact, it intensified in the 20th century and became even more virulent in the various forms of 20th century totalitarianism. And it's Pope Pius XI, who was Pope from 1922 to 1939, who addressed this set of problems. The attack by the totalitarian powers, Italian fascism, German National Socialism, and first of all, of course, Leninist Bolshevism in Russia, in four important encyclicals, three of which were written in 1937, one in 1931. Pius XI thought he might be able to work with Mussolini when Mussolini first came to power, but it became clear that when Mussolini said what fascism means, what totalitarianism means, is everything within the state, nothing outside the state, everything for the state, he wasn't just blowing hot air. He meant it. He meant it. And so Catholic youth groups were being banned, Catholic action organizations were being banned, clergy were being beaten up. So in 1931, Pius XI writes the encyclical Non abbiamo bisogno, we have no need of telling you all these awful things that were going on, which was a profound Catholic critique of the fascist project in Italy. 6 years later, Hitler has been in power in Germany for 5 years, 4 years at that point. And Pope Pius XI writes a biting encyclical called in German Mit brennender Sorge, with burning care, with burning concern. You know, we look at all this stuff going on in Germany, in which he condemns what he called the pagan idolatry of state and race. 10 days after that, or maybe a week after that, I can't quite remember, he issues another encyclical called Divini Redemptoris, which is a frontal assault on the communist attack on the church, which had been underway in Russia since 1922. And then, also in 1937, it was almost like the encyclical of the month club. Pius XI issues an encyclical called Firmissimum Constantiam, challenging something that most Americans don't know about. Namely, that for almost 2 decades, on our southern border, there was a Stalinist state. It was Mexico under the most stringent forms of what were called the Popular Revolutionary Party, the Institutional Revolutionary Party. These were real Stalinists, and they were after the church. Some of you may know about the Cristero Rebellion against all of that. Knights of Columbus made an interesting film about that years ago. Graham Greene wrote a powerful novel about that period called The Power and the Glory. There were many, many martyrs. And Pius XI had something to say about all of that. So the mid-20th century is a time of the intensification of the conflict between this particular form of political modernity, the totalitarian states in Italy, Germany, Russia, and to some considerable extent Mexico. So by the time we get to the end of the Second World War, 1945, Pius XII, successor to Pius XI and his Cardinal Secretary of State, who had been very involved in all four of those encyclicals condemning various forms of totalitarian power, comes to the view that constitutional democracy is that form of government in the modern world that is most likely to respect what we might call the rights of God, basic human rights, and the rights of the church. Even as that recognition, which he began to express in a series of radio addresses during the Second World War, all at Christmas time, even as that beginning of a Catholic wrestling with the possibility that constitutional democracy might be the best we could hope for in this world under conditions of modernity, the threat axis, if you will, was also intensifying with the continuation of communism in what we used to call captive nations of Central and Eastern Europe. After the Second World War, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, the incorporation, of the Baltic states, including intensely Catholic Lithuania, into the Soviet Union, then the communist takeover in China, and a growing Catholic Church is severely persecuted there. And throughout the world, the communist states maintained a great academically based, fake academically based, propaganda machine of state atheism. It wasn't a question of simply marginalizing the church in communist states. It was a matter of reconfiguring people's minds so that religious conviction was understood to be something that only silly people took seriously. So, when in 1959, Pope John XXIII summons the Second Vatican Council to examine the ways in which the Church should live its evangelical vocation to proclaim the gospel in what's becoming the late modern world, the second half of the 20th century, it was clear that something had to be said by the council about church and state. This could not be put aside as a secondary issue, and especially something had to be said about religious freedom. 4 groups of Catholic bishops came to the Second Vatican Council in 1962, which, as you remember, lasted from 1962 to 1965, meeting in the fall months of 1962, 63, 64, and 65. 4 groups of bishops came to the council eager for a Catholic affirmation of religious freedom. The first group were what we might call the ecumenists, bishops who were deeply concerned about the fracture of the Christian world, the many fractures in the Christian world, who wanted to see what the Catholic Church could contribute to healing those fractures, and who knew that a full Catholic participation in the ecumenical movement, which had begun in its 20th century form in 1910 at a great meeting of Protestant denominations in Edinburgh, Scotland, Catholic participation in that ecumenical movement was not going to be possible unless the Catholic Church was detached from state power. It just wasn't going to work under any other circumstances. That's the first group, the ecumenists. Then there were the Americans. In 1895, which was only 70 years before the council, less than 70 years before the council started, Pope Leo XIII sent a letter to the bishops of the United States marking the centenary, the 100th anniversary of the establishment of the American hierarchy, in which he commented very happily and favorably on the growth of the church in the United States, and said that this distinctive American arrangement, a constitutional separation of church and state institutionally, could be tolerated. Might not be the ideal, but tolerari potest. It could be tolerated. Well, the American bishops came to Vatican II wanting to move beyond tolerari potest. They wanted an affirmation that the institutional separation of church and state was the way to go, was the norm, not the acceptable exception. Then there were the bishops from behind the Iron Curtain. I see that my friend Paul Kengor is coming here in a few weeks, and I'm sure he'll talk about this then. The bishops from behind the Iron Curtain wanted a definition of religious freedom as a weapon against communist tyranny. They wanted to be able to say publicly to the communist authorities who had been persecuting them at that point for over 20 years, look, we stand for the rights of conscience of everyone. We're not asking special privileges for Catholics. We stand for the rights of conscience of everyone, and you are trying to coerce the consciences of everyone. Okay? So the bishops from behind the Iron Curtain wanted a tool with which to continue their struggle against communist power. And then there were the fourth group, bishops from Western Europe, who were tired of fighting the French Revolution. There were sectors of European Catholicism, even in the early 1960s, which imagined that a return to the old regimes, altar and throne unification, was a desirable thing. And the great example of this was in France, where the church in France had been bitterly and deeply divided ever since the French Revolution between residual royalists who wanted to repeal everything that had happened since 1789, and what were called Republicans, small r, who said, look, that was settled politically. Let's find a way to live as a church in this new situation. That was a bitter, bitter division in French Catholicism for over 100 years, and it paralyzed the church. And it led to some very bad stuff, like the collaboration of some Catholic authorities with the Vichy government of France after France's surrender to Germany in 1940. So they wanted to get that out of the way by a robust definition of religious freedom, which by implication would mean state power is not being put behind the truth claims of the church. That sounds like a powerful coalition, and it was, but there was a certain theological stumbling block. Because the official Roman theology of church and state, the official Roman theology of the nature of the state, at that point in Catholic history, particularly as it had developed from, say, the 1920s through the mid-1950s, held the view that error has no rights. Error does not have rights. So if erroneous religious opinions cannot claim a right to express themselves. The answer to this was given by Catholic theologians of a different cast of mind throughout the 1950s, which the Council eventually adopted. And the answer was that persons have rights, whether their opinions are erroneous or not. To talk about error having no rights or error having rights is just an abstraction that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Rights inhere in persons, whether their opinions are right, correct or not. And this was a way, in fact, of expressing an old truth that had perhaps been lost sight of over the centuries, or at least not given sufficient attention, and that was the classical Catholic notion that the act of faith must be made freely, or it is not an act of faith. If the act of faith is not made without coercion, it can't be a true act of faith. It's not authentic. Or as the man who would become Pope Benedict XVI put it in his singularly luminous way in 1987, God wishes to be adored by people who are free. God wishes to be adored by people who are free. God is not interested in coerced admiration. Okay? Now, that brings us, finally, to Karol Wojtyła, the man who would become Pope John Paul II. What did he bring to the Second Vatican Council? Well, first of all, he brought a distinctive personal experience as an adult. With the exception of 2 years in Rome, during which he did his first doctorate in 1946 and 1948, from the time that he was 19 years old until the time of the Second Vatican Council, he had lived under totalitarian regimes. The Nazi occupation of Poland for 5 years, followed by the communist usurpation of Polish liberties in the wake of the Second World War. So he knew from inside, not as a theoretical matter, but from inside, the nature of the totalitarian assault on Christian faith. Secondly, he brought the experience that was utterly formative of him as a young priest and bishop, and that was the experience of being a university chaplain, which I think is of particular interest in a setting like this. The formative experience of Karol Wojtyła's priesthood was his experience in creating for young students in Krakow, university students, what I called in Witness to Hope, zones of freedom where they could explore religious faith, where they could explore the deeper questions of their lives in an open environment in which conscience was respected and conscience was formed in order to be ordered to the truth. And then there was the distinctive experience of being in Krakow, the city where he had lived since he first moved there in 1918 as a student at the Jagiellonian University, and where he remained for precisely 40 years. Krakow is a beautiful place, and in many respects, it's the historic cultural capital of Poland. So that in those 125 years, between 1795 in 1918, when the state of Poland disappears from the map of Europe because it's been carved up by the Russians, the Prussians, and the Austrians. Krakow is kind of the national safe deposit box of Poland's identity and culture, and to a large extent, faith. This tradition of tenacious Polishness, if you will, at the heart of which was Polish Catholicism, continued during the communist period. And the communist authorities understood that, and they understood that somehow they had to create an alternative to Krakow, which embodied Polish resistance to tyranny from the days of Tadeusz Kościuszko in the late 18th century, the guy who designed West Point for us, then went home as a Polish freedom fighter, to the present. So what do? One of the first things the communists do, after they take over Poland in 1945, is they start to build a new town to the east of Krakow. It's called Nowa Huta, which means new forge. It was going to be a steel milling town, and it was the first human settlement in 1,000 years of Polish history built deliberately without a church. So this whole new city, this is going to be like Minneapolis, St. Paul, if you will, or Covington, Cincinnati. This whole new town where new Soviet man was going to be manufactured, as well as steel, was the first human settlement in Polish history deliberately built without a church. Enforced godlessness, if you will. This led to a 20-plus year fight to get a church built in Nowa Huta. And shortly after he was ordained a bishop in 1958, young Bishop Karol Wojtyła, the man who would become Pope John Paul II, begins celebrating Christmas midnight Mass in an open field in Nowa Huta where people wanted to build a church. And there are tens of thousands of people there, and it's snow all over the place, and it's freezing cold. And this goes on every Christmas for the next almost 10 years. What was that? Well, like forming those groups of young people that he would take out on kayaking trips or skiing trips or hiking in the Tatras, whatever, this was a zone of freedom. Embodying, in some sense, in this blank space, but filled with people worshiping, embodying the truth that religious freedom is the first of civil and political rights, because once that's in place, civil society is possible. So, Wojtyła comes to Vatican II, bringing a number, he in a sense bridged a number of those groups of bishops who wanted to a conciliar definition of religious freedom, or perhaps better, was a link between them. He understood the ecumenical problem. He understood the importance of a Catholic assertion of religious freedom against the communists. He understood that the French Revolution was over, and whether you thought that was a good idea or not, it was time to move on. And he certainly had been impressed by the American experience of a vibrant Catholicism under conditions of a constitutional democracy with constitutional separation of church and state, but no state interference with the church. So he is a supporter throughout Vatican II of a conciliar definition of religious freedom as a basic, indeed the basic, civil right, and to ground that right, to base it on the dignity of the human person, that we can know by both revelation and reason. And that led to the definition of religious freedom in the Declaration on Religious Freedom of Vatican II, Dignitatis Humanae, in which the key section reads as follows. This Vatican Council declares that the human person has a right to religious freedom. This freedom means that all men are to be immune from coercion on the part of individuals or of social groups and of any human power, in such wise that no one is to be forced to act in a manner contrary to his own beliefs, whether privately or publicly, whether alone or in association with others, within due limits. The Council further declares that the right to religious freedom has its foundation in the very dignity of the human person, as this dignity is known through the revealed Word of God and by reason itself. This right of the human person to religious freedom is to be recognized in the constitutional law whereby society is governed, and thus it is to become a civil right. Now, the bishops of Vatican II, Ed Wojtyła was urging, and others also claimed, taught, that the right of religious freedom implies the duty to seek the truth. This is not a free-floating right of choice. Religious freedom is a right that enables us to fulfill the human duty also built into us by reason of our dignity and inalienable value to seek the truth. So the definition goes on to say, the Council goes on to say, it is in accordance with their dignity as persons, that is, beings endowed with reason and free will, and therefore privileged to bear personal responsibility, that all men should be at once impelled by nature and also bound by a moral obligation to seek the truth, especially religious truth. They are also bound to adhere to the truth once it is known and to order their whole lives in accord with the demands of truth. However, men cannot discharge these obligations in a manner keeping with their human nature unless they enjoy immunity from external coercion as well as psychological freedom. Therefore, the right to religious freedom has its foundation not in the subjective disposition of the person, Frank Sinatra, I did it my way, but in the human person's very nature. In consequence, the right to this immunity continues to exist even in those who do not live up to their obligation of seeking the truth and adhering to it, and the exercise of this right is not to be impeded, provided that just public order is observed. Wojtyła would bring this understanding of religious freedom back to Krakow with him, where he was the archbishop for the following 13 years, between the end of the council in 1965 and his election as pope on October 16, 1978. When I was writing Witness to Hope, one night at dinner, which is one of the venues in which the Pope liked to talk about these things, his secretary, who had been with him for a very long time, said to me what he understood I knew, but he wanted to nail it down. He said, you have to understand that during those years, we were not like a parliamentary opposition to a ruling party. Okay, the church is sort of like the parliamentary opposition in a democracy. It was all war all the time. They were after us all the time. The first time I visited the Archbishop's residence in Krakow in 1991, Wojtyła's successor as Archbishop of Krakow, a wonderful man named Franciszek Macharski, took me around the the Archbishop's residence, showing me where all of the electronic bugs were in the residence. You know, they're in the grates in the heater, they're in the lamps, they're under the dining room table. I mean, constant surveillance. Every time they wanted to talk about something serious, Wojtyła and his associates would take a walk around this great greensward called the Planty. It surrounds the medieval part of the city of Krakow. But the key to this, excuse me, was finally getting a church built in Nowa Huta. So after almost 30 years of fighting over this, the authorities in the mid-1970s concede that a church can be built in Nowa Huta, which Wojtyła consecrated and dedicated in 1976. It's called the Ark Church because it's a very stunning, striking piece of modern church architecture in which the ceiling, if you will, or the roof, is a huge boat, like an ark. And there's a cross coming out of it, and it stands on a pediment, which is the nave of the church, which is covered with 2 million smooth stones from the riverbeds of Poland. And of course, the architectural metaphor is this is the ark in which the church is gathering its people against the storms of persecution that surround them. I am not a great fan of modern church architecture. I make an exception for the Ark Church, and I have an image of it in my bedroom at home because of what it represents. Okay, Wojtyła comes to Rome on October 16th, 1978. He's elected pope, and he immediately begins signaling that religious freedom is going to be a priority in his pontificate. The most dramatic expression of this, of course, was in his inaugural sermon on October 22nd, 1978, with that great antiphon, "Be not afraid, open the doors to Christ." Open the doors to Christ. I mean, that was quite understood in Moscow and elsewhere as a direct challenge. In fact, it's within a month after that I show in the second volume of the biography that Yuri Andropov, then the head of the KGB, ordered a study of what does it mean for us because this rabble-rousing Polish bishop is now the Pope. A few weeks after his election, he makes a pilgrimage to a Marian shrine in the little village of Mentorella in Italy, and someone who was visiting Italy from Czechoslovakia, behind the Iron Curtain, shouts to him, "Remember the Church of Silence." And he calls back, "It is no longer a church of silence because it speaks with my voice." He sends his Cardinal Zucchetto, the little skullcap, surreptitiously to the church in Lithuania, in the capital of Lithuania, in Vilnius, where it's displayed in this beautiful Marian shrine called Ostra Brahma in Vilnius. He meets publicly with the head of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, who was living in Rome in exile. The Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church was the world's largest underground religious organization for 40 years. It was officially dissolved by the Soviet authorities in 1946. Its properties were taken over by the Russian Orthodox Church. And for 40 years, from 1946, actually 45 years, till 1991, this Catholic community of Byzantine Rite lived underground. Clandestine seminaries, masses said in the forests, no public presence whatever. John Paul II meets, speaks with symbolically embraces the head of this exiled church, another signal to the Soviet authorities that there is a new sheriff in Dodge, if you will. The crucial moment then comes in June 1979 when John Paul II returns to Poland for the first time as Pope. This in itself is almost kind of a funny story. It was obvious that he was going to go back, and he wanted to go back for the celebration of the feast of his predecessor as Bishop of Krakow, St. Stanislaus, we would say, in May 1979, and wanted to go for 3 days. Well, St. Stanislaus is known sometimes as the Polish Becket because he was whacked by a king in an early church-state contest. And, you know, the communists were not having that. I mean, the symbolism was just too much to bear. So dummies that they were, vicious dummies, but dummies nonetheless, they traded 3 days in May for 9 days in June, and then the church moved the feast of St. Stanislaus to June. The crucial day is the day he arrives, June 2nd, 1979. There is a massive public open-air mass in what was then called Victory Square in Warsaw, 500,000 people, and they begin to chant, "We want God, we want God." And the head of the Polish Communist Party is sitting in a hotel room overlooking this and probably needing a new set of underwear at the end of it because he's getting nervous here. The message that John Paul then preached in Poland over the next 9 days was a striking and powerful one. He gave over 50 addresses during those 9 days, homilies, lectures to different groups, meetings with university students, whatever. He never talked about politics once. He never talked about economics once. In 50 variations on one great theme, he said to these people he knew so well, "You are not who they say you are. Permit me to remind you who you are. You are people formed by a distinctive history and a distinctive culture, and at the center of that is your Catholic faith. If you own that, you will eventually find tools of resistance that communism cannot match because they're going to be spiritual tools. Those guys have all the material power, but you can claim a different form of power." And those 9 days and the demand for religious freedom that was at the center of those 9 days led to what I have called for some 30 years now a revolution of conscience. First in Poland and then throughout Central and Eastern Europe, what a Polish historian called an exodus from the censored world, the Egypt of the censored world where nobody could speak freely. And that revolution of conscience eventually produced over 9 more years, 10 years, the nonviolent political revolution of 1989. Now, it's important not to romanticize this, although it is terribly romantic and great adventure story. But there were obviously multiple motivations involved in forming this revolution of conscience. My favorite expression of that, which is, I think, quoted in Witness to Hope, is a coal miner outside of Katowice in Silesia who was one of 500,000 people attending a mass with John Paul II, and in June 1979, and a reporter asks him, "Why are you here?" And he says, "To praise the Mother of God and to spite those bastards." So, I mean, there was, little human and divine working together here. The June 1979 trip is followed up, of course, within a few months by the Pope's visit to the United Nations in October 1979, where he, in his address, locates religious freedom, freedom of conscience, and the freedom to manifest religious faith in public as the first of civil rights. I happened to be there at that occasion, and you could see how nervous the representatives of tyranny were becoming as they listened to this unapologetic defense of religious freedom as the first of civil rights. Then comes, of course, the formation of the Solidarity movement out of this revolution of conscience. And then comes the assassination attempt of May 13th, 1981. That revolution of conscience led to a new kind of politics. The normal method of great social change in the 20th century was mass violence. Whether you think of the First World War, the Second World War, the communization of China, any mass social movement in the 20th century had been marked by an enormous bloodbath. Tens of millions of people dead. 1989, the collapse of communist power in Central and Eastern Europe between June of that year and the Czech Velvet Revolution in December was completely different. With the exception of Romania, where there was a bit of violence, these regimes simply crumbled under the impact of a new kind of politics, a nonviolent politics, shaped by the revolution of conscience that John Paul II had ignited in 1979 and that had nurtured throughout the 1980s. He then reflected on all this in the encyclical Centesimus Annus in 1991, where in analyzing the year 1989, as the third chapter of that encyclical is titled, he said that the deepest cause of the communist crack-up was the spiritual void created when communism tried to, quote, supplant or uproot the need for God from the human heart, which he said could not be done without throwing the heart into turmoil. Okay? So a very distinctive cultural, spiritual reading of history and the signs of the times. John Paul II continued to defend religious freedom throughout his pontificate. He wasn't interested in this just for Central and Eastern Europe. This was most notable perhaps in Central America in the mid-1980s. But this defense of religious freedom as the first of human rights and the importance of religiously informed moral argument in shaping the free society of the future really came to a head right before his death. In 2003, 2004, the newly expanded European Union, which was going to incorporate these newly liberated, auto-liberated countries of Central and Eastern Europe, was writing a new constitutional treaty to govern the expanded EU. That treaty is 400 pages long, which is about 385 pages too long for a real constitution. But in all of that verbiage, the biggest argument, which went on for over a year and a half, was over one word. Whether in the preamble to the European Constitutional Treaty, the Maastricht Treaty as it came to be known, the word Christianity could be mentioned as one of the sources of 21st century Europe's commitments to human rights, civility, tolerance, the rule of law, democratic process, and all the good stuff. And the first draft of the treaty, of that preamble, said the sources of 21st century Europe's commitments to civility, tolerance, democracy, rule of law, human rights are the classical heritage, the Enlightenment, and modern thought. I wrote at the time, that means nothing of consequence for 21st century Europe happened between Marcus Aurelius and Descartes, which is a hell of a long time for nothing to have happened. John Paul II waded into that argument even in his physical difficulties of the time, as he's battling Parkinson's disease, by insisting that to try to build the future by simply ignoring one of the deepest roots of the Western civilizational project, which is of course biblical religion, was to set in motion real problems for the future. Well, when things finally sorted out, religious heritage was mentioned in this preamble, but Christianity remained the bugaboo word. And that deep secularist bias remains today, not only in Europe, but here. And we need to face that and think about how it might be reversed. Some implications of all this very briefly for today. We use the language of the separation of church and state very loosely, but if we're going to be precise about this, we ought to insist that whatever that separation may mean, and there are all sorts of connections between church and state, as we know, that separation cannot mean that bringing religious conviction or religiously informed moral conviction into public life is banned. That's undemocratic. If you tell people they cannot bring the sources of their deepest moral convictions into public life, you're disenfranchising them. Now, people who do that have to have the political sense to make those religiously informed moral arguments in a way that people who have not been given the gift of faith can hear and engage. But you can't say that religiously informed moral argument is out of bounds in public life. Unfortunately, our Supreme Court over the past 15 years has been doing much better on that. So we're in reasonably decent shape on this today, although battles continue. What about China? What about the current Vatican policy in China? You know, several years ago, the Vatican made a deal with the People's Republic of China in which the Chinese Communist Party is allowed to propose names for men to be made bishops, and the church then says thumbs up or thumbs down. That is a direct violation of the teaching of the Second Vatican Council, which said that no rights of appointment are to be given to secular authorities in the appointment of bishops, a teaching that was then instantiated in the canon law of the church. John Paul II would never have made that deal that has been made in recent years. Similarly, I don't think his voice would have been muted as the Vatican's voice has been muted in recent years over the situation in Nicaragua, where there is a systematic attempt to destroy the church underway. I think the last groups of religious women were just expelled from Nicaragua recently, where priests are being kept in torture prisons. There would not have been a muted voice in the face of the persecution of the church in Venezuela or Cuba. There would have been a respectful but firm dialogue, I think, with the Modi government in India, and the notion that India must be governed by a form of Hindu nationalism in which Christians are essentially second-class citizens and which so-called proselytism, which we would call evangelization, is a very dangerous business. And then there is the question of religious freedom in Islamic countries, which is a very, very challenging one indeed. So, the quest for religious freedom, of which John Paul II was a great hero for so many years, continues today. And it continues because this first of civil rights sets the table for all the rest, all the other things we want to describe as rights, by setting the foundations of civil society. If Caesar is not God, if there are things of God's that are not Caesar's, then there is space for family, for voluntary associations, for non-state educational institutions, for all of the things that we call civil society. So let's be grateful that many of us lived in the time of a real hero of religious freedom, and let's learn from his example about how to defend that first of civil rights today for ourselves and for others around the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Weigel. So I was going to start asking a couple of questions and then open it up to all of you. President Cholo, feel free to jump in. So the first question that I had from what you were sharing is if you could help clarify what the church means by a right. When Dignitatis Humanae uses that word, when Rerum Novarum uses that word, I think it's a different way of using it than we commonly use it in our American modern life. So I was just hoping for some clarity on that really quickly.
We on here? Good. I have to say, I think official Catholic documents have been a bit promiscuous in the use of rights talk. It doesn't really help advance the cause of what I would call basic human rights, to describe everything that you find socially or economically or culturally desirable as a right. It just, if everything is red, nothing is red. Mm-hmm. If everything is green, nothing is green. If everything's a right, then nothing is a right. At the very least, we need to distinguish between basic human rights and other social desiderata. What I understand a right to mean in classic Catholic thought is an immunity, a built-in immunity. It's not something a state gives you. This is built into you by reason of your human dignity. An immunity from coercive power in order to fulfill certain obligations. So, the obligation to seek the truth, religious freedom. The obligation to participate in the search for the common good, the right of free speech. The obligation to be an active citizen in whatever form you choose, the right of association. Mm-hmm. Rights and duties linked. I think that linkage has gotten a little bit attenuated in the Church's rights language, and perhaps a little more rights asceticism would be a good idea here. For those of you who are interested in this on the political side, my great friend, Professor Mary Ann Glendon, emerita at the Harvard Law School, wrote a very important book 20 years ago called Rights Talk, about how this proliferation of rights was weakening the whole idea of human rights, and we need to draw on the reins here a little bit.
Thank you. The other question I wanted some clarity on is when you spoke about the 4 groups, sort of encampments at Vatican II.
Right.
And it almost sounds right like the Americans won, in the sense that the conclusion of the document is saying that the human person has a right to religious freedom. I was hoping for you to clarify what do you understand to be the distinction between the Church's conception of religious freedom and an American conception of religious freedom?
Well, let's take that in 2 pieces.
Okay.
I would not say the Americans won. They won in the sense that they got a robust definition of religious freedom. It was the Western Europeans and Wojtyła who cut the Gordian knot of error has no rights, rather than trying to untangle that by simply cutting it and saying that's formulating the question the wrong way.
Okay.
Persons have rights whether their views are erroneous or not. So, there was a genuine coalition of agreement on that. There's an implication in Dignitatis Humanae, and indeed in the Pastoral Constitution on the Church in the Modern World, that is not stated as bluntly as I'm going to state it, but I think the implication is there. And that is that the state, by its nature, political authority by its nature, in and of itself, is theologically incompetent. Now, that seems to be fairly obvious to me. If they can't fix the potholes, you don't want them pronouncing on the incarnation. I mean, this is, you're out of your lane here. Now, that does not mean that the state is not bound by or accountable to certain moral norms that we can know by reason. But you don't want the state messing in theological questions, because it's just not within state competence. Now, there is some degree of recognition of that in the history of the First Amendment. The First Amendment did not set up a wall of separation between church and state. That is Thomas Jefferson's phrase from a letter he wrote years after the Constitution had been adopted, and it should be remembered that Jefferson was not part of the drafting of the Constitution or the Bill of Rights, although his buddy James Madison obviously was. The separation of church and state meant, at least in those days, first, there is going to be no national church. Now, there were still state-established churches in the United States for some years. They eventually, withered away in the 19th century, but there was going to be no national church. There was going to be no religious test for public office. Okay? Anybody could hold a public office. And that was about it. It was a fairly minimalist definition. Now, when you get into the mid-20th century, deep confusions enter into all of this, primarily from judges on the Supreme Court, justices on the Supreme Court, of a particularly secularist cast of mind, and in the legal academy. One of the most, years ago, 20-some years ago, one of the most prominently used legal constitutional law textbooks, con law textbooks, in American law schools was written by a fellow named Larry Tribe, Lawrence Tribe at Harvard University. And in his discussion of the First Amendment, he says, the free exercise clause carves out of the no establishment clause a zone of permissible accommodation to religious interests. Well, that's a little weird. I mean, that's a little weird. And I think the present Supreme Court has come to understand that. Now, my great friend, Father Richard John Newhouse, used to argue endlessly that there were not two religion clauses, free exercise and no establishment. There was one religion clause in which no establishment served the purpose of free exercise. You don't have an established state church so that people can exercise freely their religious convictions. Now, the present court, the court over the past 10 or 15 years, has never taken that position in those terms, but they're getting close to it. They're getting close to it. And I think this has been not only a rebalancing, but a return to the fairly obvious meaning of the text. Congress shall make no law concerning an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Why would you have no establishment unless you wanted to promote free exercise? So I think we're getting in better shape on that front here. And I think that's an understanding of religious freedom that is completely congruent with Dignitatis Humanae and the teaching of the Council. Now, the way we do this is not the only way to do this, okay? I mean, you can have an established state church and religious freedom. I mean, I think, there is religious freedom in the United Kingdom, and there's a state church. Now, the state church is, as the joke goes, the Church of England is the church that most Englishmen know they don't go to on Sunday morning. But we had, those of you who watched the coronation of King Charles. I mean, that was an Anglican religious ceremony with this coronation, including a kingly anointing in an Old Testament way, dropped into the middle of it. Now, I watched the whole thing because I love that music. And my friend James McMillan wrote one of the pieces, and so forth and so on. But I have to say, I found it extremely odd that if you looked carefully on the altar in the apse of Westminster Abbey, where the whole thing took place, the symbols of state power, the crown, the orb, the scepter, all that stuff, were on the altar right beside the chalice and the paten and the Eucharistic materials, if you will. That's a little too close for comfort, from my point of view. It's an attempt to sacralize the state that almost inevitably leads to the subordination of the church. So while there is religious freedom there, I don't think there's a coherent theory of it at the moment. But that's a minor problem compared to, say, the major problem of China. I mean, it's not just persecution of the church there, although there is that. It's this whole program that Xi Jinping calls the sinicization, the Chinification of religion. So that in Catholic churches in China today, the religious symbols have been replaced, like Stations of the Cross, statues, pictures of Our Lady, pictures of our Lord, with Xi Jinping sayings. Now, if that's the sinicization of religion, that means the evacuation of biblical content from religion. So this is a huge problem.
Let's open it up now. If you have questions, we have students who have microphones, so if you raise your hand, then she will bring it to you. Kendall, will you? Thank you.
You know, when we say the Pledge of Allegiance, we say under God.
Right.
And I was just wondering if that's putting pressure or something on people that do not have any faith at all.
Yeah.
And, you know, do you think in the secular world we're in now that it would be deleted in some way in the future or something?
My understanding is that the phrase "under God" was only added to the pledge in 1954 or something like that during the Eisenhower administration. You know, Ike is often mocked for saying, America needs religion and I don't care what it is. You know, as if he were some kind of complete dummy. Well, look, this guy helped win the Second World War. He's not a complete dummy. I think what he meant in his own simple Kansan way was that a sense of the transcendent value and dignity of the human person, which you can get rationally, but most people are going to get religiously, is essential to the functioning of a democracy. Now, whether that requires the use of that phrase in the Pledge of Allegiance, I suppose you could argue about that. People can keep silent at that moment if they choose. Right now, I think to do that, to remove that phrase from the pledge, would be a concession to some of the worst, the most aggressive secularist elements in the country, and that's probably not a good idea.
Could you say something about the rise of Christian nationalism and how that...
Yeah, that's an interesting question, Monsignor. Monsignor is really something. I had the privilege of speaking to the priest yesterday of the diocese, and man, he comes up with Augustine De Trinitate, chapter 12, and I mean, it was right there. So you are very fortunate to have this learned man here on this campus. I would distinguish, Monsignor, between Christian patriotism, a sense of love of country, which is informed by a religious an understanding that the country values religious conviction and allows for its free exercise. I am very nervous about nationalism as it's understood in many respects today, because the history of modern nationalism is not a happy one. It almost inevitably tends toward the xenophobic, and that's something that we have to avoid in this country, because we are 330 million people, and there's a lot of difference here. And we've got to find a way to live in harmony for the common good with that difference. So if we begin to define American nationalism in racial or ethnic terms, if that's where that concept is leading, that's big trouble in my view. If Christians are, as we find in the New Testament, strangers in a strange land. We are always that, no matter where we are. There's a very important text from what's called sub-apostolic Christianity, the Christianity that follows right on the time of the apostles. This is the early 2nd century, and it's called the Letter to Diognetus. It's in any proper text from the early fathers of the church. Nobody knows who Diognetus was, and nobody knows who wrote a letter to him. But it has a very important section where it says Christians are to the world as the soul is to the body, and that Christians live in every society as exiles, but can live in any society as if it were home. Why? Because our ultimate loyalty is someplace else, and our ultimate destiny is another kingdom. Now, the paradox of that is that frees you up to be a good citizen. Hence the twofold nature of this. Strangers in a strange land, but exiles at home. That's the Christian condition everywhere. It's the Christian condition in Nigeria, it's the Christian condition in Singapore, it's the Christian condition here. Our ultimate loyalty is not to our political home, but it is precisely because of that that we can be good citizens, because we can remind the state that it isn't everything. Okay? Now, when that sense of patriotism, as John Paul II would say, deteriorates into a narrow nationalism, then you inevitably get problems. So I'm a bit nervous about this development, although I understand that it is in part a reaction to over half a century of secularist aggression against religious communities and religious individuals. But, you know, you don't fix that problem by going all the way to the other end of the spectrum. So that would be my thought on that.
Are there any other questions?
She's going to bring you a mic here.
There you go.
Is that better? Yeah, I read a book on, because I was fascinated about, Pope John Paul II and Ronald Reagan and, the impact that they had on the fall of communism. And there's a book out that talks about Margaret Thatcher and
Yeah, John
Reagan.
O'Sullivan's book.
Yeah, and I read the
He
book.
told me I should have sued him for plagiarism. I said, you're right, I should have.
No, but I was just wondering your thoughts on that, and they talk about that trifecta of individuals that led a lot to the fall.
John's a good friend, and we kid about this all the time. I mean, he's fighting his corner by adding Mrs. Thatcher, for whom he worked, to the mix here. I don't think that works historically, nor do I think that there was some holy alliance between John Paul II and Reagan. They had a common view that the communist emperor had fewer clothes than people thought. I think they had a common view that moral pressure, including the defense of basic human rights, was crucial to challenging late communism. I think they both understood that the defense of human rights was the key to peace, in that there was never going to be a peace worthy of the name, if people were enslaved behind the Iron Curtain in one fashion or another. And I think there was a deep personal respect between them. The fact that they both survived an assassination attempt within 2 months of each other, for men who look at history from a providential point of view, there are no coincidences, it's all providence somehow. That was a bond between them. Reagan, from the beginning of his presidency, told the Central Intelligence Agency to share the intelligence take on particularly Poland with the Pope. So there was a sharing of information. There was no conspiracy of policy, but there was a sharing, and that worked vice versa, because Reagan understood that the Pope had much better sources behind the Iron Curtain than in many instances he did. So I think they would, and there really grew to be, I wouldn't call it friendship, but a deep mutual respect. A couple of years before the Pope died, I was at dinner with him, and out of the blue, he asked me, how is President Reagan doing? And I said, well, it's absolutely awful. I had run into Ed Meese, his former Attorney General, in Washington a few weeks before, and I said to Ed, how's President Reagan doing? And he said, well, it's just terrible. I had gone to the christening of the USS Ronald Reagan, big aircraft carrier, and they got the baseball hats with USS Ronald Reagan. And I took one back to him in California, because Reagan was still going into his office in LA a couple of days a week. And Ed gave him the hat, and Reagan said, well, thank you very much, Ed. Why would anyone name a ship after me? He had zero memory of having been president for 8 years. Well, when I told that to the Pope, who was in very tough shape physically at that point, he just looked stricken, as if he were thinking, all right, it's bad enough to be in a frozen body, but if you can't reflect upon your life, that's even worse. So there was this dead silence at the table for about a minute. It was just Pope, the two secretaries, and me. And then he very quietly said to me, would you get word to Mrs. Reagan that I'm praying for her husband? So I called Mr. Meese when I got back to D.C. and passed that along. So I think that speaks to that respect. So that's what I would say about all that. I mean, now, Reagan-Thatcher was a very important thing, but Thatcher-Pope was not a particularly close relationship, so John's triad doesn't quite work. And he did say to me of the part on the Pope, he said, you should have sued me for plagiarism. And I said, I'm very well aware of that.
Kendall, I think there's one. Oh, you have.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Yeah. So you'd mentioned that there was a recent agreement between the Vatican and the Communist Party in China
Right.
that allowed them to lead the conversation, the identification of the bishops, and that goes directly against canon law, and that St. John
Right.
Paul would never have gone for that. I'm curious, though, what do you see as the alternative that he would have gone for in dealing with
Well,
China?
you support the underground church. You try to reach agreement through ongoing diplomatic efforts on the appointment of bishops. But you don't hand over the church to the effective control of a communist party, which, as I was just saying, wants to sinicize religion, which means to empty it of Christian content. That would mean a very difficult period for a while, but I have been very publicly critical of this in a number of columns and articles. And several years ago, I was at a social occasion in Rome with Archbishop Gallagher, who's the foreign minister of the Vatican, who's a nice guy, Englishman from Liverpool. And I said, look, I want you to understand what my criticism of this is. I am not criticizing this policy as an American of a conservative political disposition. I'm criticizing it because I think it's lethal for the evangelical future of the church in China. The Chinese Communist Party is no more immortal than any other communist party. It's going to go at some point. And that point may be sooner than later because they've got all sorts of problems, demographic, economic, etc. But irrespective of whether it's 20 years from now or 100 years from now, when Chinese communism collapses, China will be the greatest field of Christian mission since the Europeans came to the Western Hemisphere in the 16th century. It's going to be wide open, 1 billion people. Comparative advantage in that will not be with religious communities that have kowtowed or made deals with the regime that just collapsed. It's going to be with the people who resisted. And it's the resistance communities, even if they've had to survive underground, that will be the seed of evangelization for the future. So that's my approach to that. I do not think of this fundamentally politically, but evangelically. It's bad strategy for the church of the new evangelization in the 21st century and beyond.
I'd like to ask one question to close. When you were mentioning his celebration of Mass as before he was Pope in the field,
Yes.
in the Christmas Masses, I was really, tears were coming to my eyes thinking, before you mentioned it, his refrain, "Be not afraid," right? Because already he was living this way in these zones of freedom, as you called them. And I was thinking in our current American political moment, in this hyper-polarized situation, what, in your experience, are zones of freedom? And what would he invite us to live in a similar way?
Yeah.
To be not afraid and to find these zones of freedom that help us to express the relationship between faith and culture.
Well, I think places like this are zones of freedom. I mean, an authentically Catholic liberal arts institution is a zone of freedom in which people can learn to argue without being brutal about it, where people can learn the arts of civility and then bring that into society. So, this is one. This and similarly situated institutions. Let me just say a word about him. As how could he say that, "Be not afraid," and not come across as a romantic or somebody who's blowing smoke or whatever? I explain this in these terms. Most Americans have absolutely no idea how awful the Second World War was in Poland. In 1945, 20% of the Poles who were alive in 1939 were dead. So 20% mortality rate across society. Every major city leveled, with the exception of Krakow. And 5 years of just a draconian occupation, which was aimed at essentially eliminating the Poles as a people. Hans Frank, this gangster who ran Poland for Hitler, said they will eat little, they will work much, and they will disappear. In that environment in which there was no rule of law, in which if you looked the wrong way at a German soldier or a Gestapo guy or whatever, and he didn't like it, he could shoot you down and nothing would happen to him. So one of Wojtyła's underground seminary classmates said to me of that, it was not knowing whether you would be alive on your next birthday or next Christmas or whatever. It was 5.5 years of not knowing whether you would be alive tomorrow. That's a pressure cooker. And people reacted to it in different ways. Some people went into violent resistance, some people went mad, some people committed suicide, some people tried to just get along, survive. I've said it's like living with the pressure. We know that beneath the surface of the earth there are enormous physical pressures going on. And they can, when they break out, they can form violent things, tsunamis, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions. But under those same pressures are formed diamonds, the hardest, brightest thing we know. And what the pressures of the Second World War, mediated through a radical, Christocentric, indeed cruciform Christian faith, was they made Karol Wojtyła into a human diamond. Someone who could cut through things that seemed impermeable, like the Berlin Wall. Somebody who could reflect light, the light of Christ, in a distinctive way. So when he said that, this was coming from inside an experience of Christocentric courage.
Right.
You know, he wasn't asking people to do anything he hadn't done or take any risk he hadn't taken. Hey, we're going to have to.
I was told we had one more question upstairs. If you can.
Going back to what you said during the talk, if I remember correctly, you were talking about like one thing was about the Chinese government and how no, I think it was about like how the Vatican, how there were different issues going on in the world, and to me it sounded like you were saying that the Vatican today isn't doing enough. So I was just wanting to know more about your opinion on the things that are going on in the world and what Pope Francis and the Vatican are doing today about some of the issues in the world, because I'd imagine they are trying to change things, but it's probably very different from what JP2 did during his time. So I was just curious as to your opinion on that.
Well, let's leave it on the question of religious freedom. I mean, Holy See is involved in all sorts of things all over the world, and you know, many of them are good things. The Catholic Church is the largest educator of girls and women in the third world. That's a good thing. The Catholic Church tries to educate leaders for countries all over the world who will govern in a moral way. That's a good thing. The Catholic Church feeds an enormous amount of people all over the world. That's a good thing. The Catholic Church works to see that people have potable water. That's a good thing. Healthcare, all the rest of it. But on the specific question of religious freedom, I think this pontificate has been weak. It has been weak in Latin America. It's been weak in China. It has reverted to a kind of approach that was taken before John Paul II during the pontificate of Paul VI, which is that, you know, dialogue. Well, that's important when the other person is an honest dialogue partner. But when the other person has declared as part of their fundamental philosophical position, I'm getting rid of you, dialogue becomes something of a one-way street. And resistance becomes imperative. So I think there's been a reversion to a notion of papal diplomacy that really failed throughout the 1970s, and that John Paul II quietly buried during his pontificate. Now, that does not mean that the Pope should be running around chastising political leaders all over, you know, go to the UN and say, you're a bad guy, you're a bad guy, you're a bad. That's not the nature of the job. But when the people of the church are under severe persecution, the chief shepherd of the church needs to say something about that.
Let us thank Professor Weigel again for being with us tonight. All right, two things to note as you exit. There are still copies of the biography for sale in the back. You can see Ray or Andrew. And then on your, outside the doors, not in the back right here, there are refreshments in the back right here. And on your chairs, there are flyers for upcoming events, notably the next IRL event with Paul Kingor to continue our series on John Paul II, as well as one with Bishop Iffert in April, where we're going to talk about ecumenism and his encyclical, John Paul II's encyclical on ecumenism. So we invite you back to the same room for those two events. So have a good evening. Thank you very much.